Daddy, Mommy get sometimes angry. Boo, 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 boo. 1, 2, 3, they throw my toys away. Boo, 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 boo. Done.
All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Fourth Culture Studios. Today we're doing a segment called Throwing Your Toys Away, where we drink tea, talk about articles that talk about art and art making. But for our first segment today, we're going to just read an article that I wrote. And then maybe in the next few weeks, I'll take some of the source material that I used in putting it together and some of the original texts that I had read and kind of like dig into those and see if we can't come up with an interesting and kind of compelling way to talk about art. So to get that started, I love this book called Art Encounters, Deleuze and Guattari by Simon O'Sullivan. And I always think you should draw in your art books. Well, draw in all of your books. So I hope that Simon O'Sullivan doesn't mind. But I wanted to start off by reading, a passage from the introduction that really captures, something really compelling, at least for me, about art making. And I'll just jump right into it. An object of encounter is fundamentally different from an object of recognition. With the latter, our knowledges, beliefs, and values are reconfirmed. We and the world we inhabit are reconfirmed as that which we already understood our world and ourselves to be. An object of recognition is then precisely a representation of something always already in place. With such a non-encounter, our habitual way of being and acting in the world is reaffirmed and reinforced. And as a consequence, no thought takes place. Indeed, we might say that representation precisely stymies thought. With a genuine encounter, however, the contrary is the case. Our typical ways of being in the world are challenged, our systems of knowledge disrupted. We are forced to thought. The encounter then operates as a rupture in our habitual modes of being, and thus in our habitual subjectivities. It produces a cut, a crack. However, this is not the end of the story, for the rupturing encounter also contains a moment of affirmation, the affirmation of a new world, in fact, a way of seeing and thinking this world differently. This is the creative moment of the encounter that obliges us to think otherwise. Life, when it is truly lived, is a history of these encounters, which will always necessarily occur beyond representation. So for me, I think that really speaks to the potential of art. Art to show and create a new world. I mean, let's just say it. And maybe maybe art is like more important now than ever before. But I think that this brings up, some other questions for me. And one of those is really like a kind of fundamental question about like ideas and where ideas come from. And I think art making and creativity in general, begin to have an answer for that. And hopefully I'll have a lot of time to kind of explore, where we think ideas are coming from. One thing, a kind of image that I really like is to think about anachronistic spaces. Think about the iPhone in relationship to the cave painters of Lascaux. It's like this idea of the iPhone just being like on the other side of that rock wall, where it's like how many people struggling and inventing did it take to get from the caves of Lascaux to the iPhone? Well, there's a historical answer for that, but it's more of like that metaphorical space that I want to think about, and when Simon O'Sullivan there is talking about the kind of cut or crack, the kind of fissure between, our world and the recognition of that new idea, and then the ways in which the artist, they're producing that cut or crack, he's saying, but also, the way the artist can like reach into that nebulous zone, the unknown, and pull into our existence those ideas. So, that being said, the article that we're going to read today is called How Dinosaur Shit Became God. But before that, let's drink some tea. So, for our tea drinking today, we are going to be having pu'er tea. Basically, there's two kinds of pu'er tea. One they call raw and one they call cooked. Now, the cooked pu'er tea, they'll pile up the leaves and they'll let the leaves begin to ferment, which dramatically shortens the aging process. Now, raw pu'er tea, they'll take the leaves and they'll press them into blocks. A raw pu'er tea can take, between 5 and 10 years to be ready to drink. A cooked pu'er tea is going to age much quicker, and, it's ready to drink within 6 months to a year. However, you can also, age both varieties. The pu'er tea that I have was given to me by one of my wife's family friends, and he has an extensive pu'er tea collection, and he likes to let a certain kind of weevil infest the pu'er tea because he thinks that, it really improves the taste. I happen to agree with him, and that's what we're drinking today. Now we wait. Right. Let's read. How dinosaur shit became God. Introduction. Maurice Merleau-Ponty talks about how our impressions of the world are sense-driven, driven by reference to the body. In this corporeality, I find a connection to other thinkers like Timothy Morton and his hyperobjects, Heidegger's World and Earth, and Deleuze and Guattari's notion of becoming. For me, the connection is a question of the boundaries of the body. Where do I stop, and where does the world begin? Or when did I start? At my birth? At conception? Or with the first anatomically human? Smaller things pile up to make larger things, piles with emergent abilities and emergent consequences. I will attempt to bring these strains of thought together and discuss them in relation to viewing works of art, speculating broadly about what constitutes body. I will explore some of the uncanny similarities between cathedrals and the internet, and then try to rein in the speculative with an approach to teaching foundation-level drawing, organized around the body as a central metaphor. The goal is to unstuck ourselves from arbitrary definitions of who and what we are, to create maximum maneuverability in the face of cultural and material machinery. Part 1. Machines for Contemplation. The Badia Fiorentina is just down the street from Kappa, the organization that helped to organize our study abroad trip to Florence. I walked past it daily without knowing what insights lay within. But that is the story of all the churches and museums in Florence. The city itself is a work of art, sculpture, architecture, and painting in a seemingly endless overlapping labyrinth. The Badia Fiorentina isn't the best example of this labyrinth. It was just at that point in the maze that it struck me. Unassumingly, behind a column is a painted cloud next to a painted, ornamental, or decorative column. The illusion is layered, and as simple as that, an epiphany. The painted clouds gives the illusion of volume, seems to float, and from the right viewing angle, the painting of architectural features can fool the eye. Both create the illusion of space. But from my point of view, it was a twisted space. I was not standing in the correct station point. I could feel the painting push me into the optimal viewing position. I wanted to stand in the place where the linear perspective would generate the most convincing illusion. This was not possible because this museum is also a functioning church and services were taking place. I was already feeling like a sinister interloper, only being interested in the art, rejecting outright the proper religious interpretation of the work. The insight is how these various illusions stack one on top of the other, the way that the painted depiction of space sits right next to an architectural space, and realizing how architecture is also a framing device for space, inventing that space. Further, how the allusion to the various cultural narratives also stack up, the story of artists against the story of worshippers. The service seemed to me like a strange costume party, but their party made me aware of my own artsy tourist garb, the way I wield my sketchbook like a shield. I am not the key to unlock that religious puzzle. As one more individual in the constant flow of tourists, we don't short-circuit with our presence alone the grand religious narrative, but we bring our own stories, our own puzzles to unlock. The work is filtered through my narrative, a puzzle about the creative process, as if Theseus, instead of fighting the Minotaur, had taken up knitting or textile installation art, what wonderfully patterned scarves he would make. Or, if he had become obsessed with topiary and used his sword to carve out beautiful animals into the walls of the labyrinth, we see the stories we are able to see and ignore the rest. The labyrinth is a hall of mirrors, but more than that, I am a body that is a labyrinth with Fibonacci passages, passages whose scale confuse inner and outer, questions a body's boundaries, makes me aware of its dynamic interplay. The desire that I feel to try to move to the optimal viewing angle when looking at a work of art is a visceral way of feeling Ponty's corporeality. I call this push and pull the Goldilocks theory of art viewing. A little too warm, a little too cool. The point is that we are bodies among bodies, objects among objects. We move around until we find the best spot for contemplation. Small, detailed images pull us in. Large, painterly images push us out. This is one way that works of art reach out and move us, push and pull us at the level of the body. They are magnetic in that way. In the way that objects in space always push and pull at one another, It is the tension between the illusion of space and flatness in painting. But it is also more. It is the realization that the world itself is an illusion. An illusion in the sense that I am an interpreting being with a point of view. Not to mention that I filter the available data through the narrow range available to my biological lenses. In Timothy Morton's book Realist Magic, he talks about an aesthetic dimension in nature, the way that objects signal to each other, animals in communication, but also objects in space. This pattern recognition and pattern generation is evolution's way to attract and repulse. Evolution is responsive, reifying the strategies that work. If evolution could be said to have an interest, then it is functionality. But does nature have an aesthetic? Does it have taste? A sense of irony, perhaps? Morton uses the term hyperobjects to talk about ecology, things like global warming and black holes, things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. It's a very visual idea. Think of all the inputs to global warming and its emergence through time as an entity, with boundaries, a beginning and an eventual ending. It has a shape. It occupies and invents its space. I want to apply that kind of thinking here to the work of art, to think about its affect and effect from conception to grave, to see it as a Deleuzian body without organs, but recognizing that these hyperobjects interact in larger networks, that the boundaries are arbitrary. Art is the extended phenotype of the human being. That time in the Badia Fiorentina, in the Cloister of Oranges, was a matrix moment. Time slowed, an epiphany about space sitting heavy in my chest. How many times did I need to see the conflation of painting and architecture for it to sink in that they are both illusionistic? The visual space created by architecture is, from the viewer's point of view, an equivalent illusion to that of painting. Architecture is a framing device, or to be blunt, architecture invents the sensation of space in the viewer. It invents the space itself, or at least my sense and awareness of it. The room shapes the possible uses of that room. Kitchen, living room, half bath. Think of all those bedrooms floating in the sky. Architects already know this, but for me, a young coffee-guzzling painter, this was a big rethink. For Merleau-Ponty, our sense of the perceptual world is embedded in our bodies, in our objecthood. Feeling this corporeality allows me to see the edges. It makes me aware of the kaleidoscopic flood of visual stimuli, that fundamental aspects of my understanding of the world, like space itself, hit me at a material level, located in my body, my materiality, from my point of view, and that I project that onto the environment. I deflate the expanse with names. To the climber, the cliff looks like a pathway. To the hawk, the groundhog's hole looks like a dinner plate, said Timothy Morton. The sensate world is a bubble that I find myself in, a bubble that expands and contracts and scales depending on the apparatus I attach to my brain, depending on the imaging technologies used. But what I find through technology's lenses are technology's images. Technology reshapes what a body means in the world, extending its abilities, extending its range. The wheel is the extension of the foot, said Marshall McLuhan. A work of art is just this sort of apparatus. The work of art has to define for itself, in visual terms, the status of its illusion. Each image prioritizes the visual elements: line, shape, space, plane, value, color, texture, creating hierarchies that put the field in tension. Think Vouillard's scintillating light, Max Beckmann's accordion-like space, or Stanley Spencer's Gumby-like figures that twist and turn against the composition's geometry. Works of art function as metonymy, their illusion and material self blending to become machines for contemplation, machines that must be activated by viewers, bodies in overlapping worlds. The work of art becomes a proposition about a possible world, a possible body to inhabit. I find Martin Heidegger's image of a church in a storm from his Origin of the Work of Art to be cogent here. The point that the force of the storm is realized and revealed in the obstruction of the church. Visual speed bumps in our accelerating worlds, more powerfully, by Susan Langer from her book, Feeling and Form. A piece of sculpture is a center of a three-dimensional space. It is a virtual kinetic volume, which dominates a surrounding space, and this environment derives all proportions and relations from it, as an actual environment does from oneself. The work is a semblance of a self and creates the semblance of tactual space, and moreover, a visual semblance. Langer's use of virtual points to the way that art activates and implies space, occupies space, and generates it. Art creates a bubble of being in a Heideggerian way. Langer extends this point from architecture to culture in important ways. A place, in this non-geographical sense, is a created thing, an ethnic domain made visible, tangible, sensible. As such, it is, of course, an illusion. Art shapes the way a place feels. Our sense of place is culture. I call this move from the virtual space of objects to the virtual space of culture the bubble theory. You live in a bubble. I live in a bubble, both literal and metaphorical. You can see that you live in a bubble with a simple drawing exercise and a walk, easiest to see in cities with tall buildings. As the buildings stretch outside the cone of vision, and if the angles are transcribed onto a two-dimensional surface, they reveal the five-point perspective that we live in. That is not how I understand what I am seeing. My brain straightens everything. To strengthen this statement, the way that the world looks to me is not the way that the world looks. I am living in an illusion. The takeaway is that understanding is translation. From visual information to 2D surface, from multiple snapshots to the fundamental understanding of space itself. Langer's move is to see the way that works of art jump from the implication of space, virtual kinetic volume, to the narratives that we use to understand and create the cultural semblance. We invent and inhabit architectural overlays to bring coherence to our purpose-driven lives. We want to make our spaces continuous, harmonious. Vision cuts down most of the available information to the manageable and practical. The big trick in foundation level drawing is to make students aware of how they are interpreting what they are seeing. Drawing is an act of translation, so awareness of how you are responding to sense data is key. Are you working primarily with the visual field or from symbol and imagination? In a studio visit, the painter Julie Heffernan called the implication of space in images feminine space or masculine space. One bulges out, one bulges in. This is a problematic description, but it helped me to understand and see the separation between the various illusions in painting, the way that a figure grouping can both respond to and generate the underlying geometry of a work of art, how composition and design create an expectation of order or chaos in the wider world, how paintings reach beyond themselves, the way that we empathize with works of art at the visceral and bodily level, the haptic quality of looking, the way that the illusions draw me into not just the work, but into the body space of the maker. When I stand in front of a work of art, I occupy the visual space of the artist and have the opportunity to understand their mind space inasmuch as it is carried through the visual. Both the artist and the viewer make and remake the work. This is the magnetism of art. This is the desire in things. This is the Goldilocks theory of art viewing. The work of art positions the viewer, invents its public. Illusion invites you in, envelops and captures you. We are fully aware that it is only illusion. The comedian, the magician, the artist, the scientist. It is the joy of jumping back and forth between this world and that, constantly adjusting the focal length, collapsing psychological distance, dancing over the gap, no point perspective to multiple perspectives, space, scale, framing, visual grouping, installation, all birth points of view, painting you into position, painting you into being. The body of the viewer and the body of the work overlap for a moment of encounter, a moment of fusion. The energy output is greater than the sum of its parts. From the atomic to the aesthetic, everything we encounter is wrapped up in this game. The positioning of the viewer, the recognition that works of art have bodily presence, is the recognition that objects have their own desires. At the material level, it is merely attraction and repulsion, boundary and permeability. It's not that objects are like humans, machines for contemplation, but that humans are like objects, the contemplation of possibility. In the real world, things happen because they can happen, but Graham Harman says that not everything that exists must be real. I think here of illusions, and I think here of the desire in things. Heidegger, in Being and Time, goes on about the world of hammers, that world being comprised of all hammers in history and all the uses they have been put to, from rocks to hammer drills. Sounds like hyperobjects to me. The design of the hammer makes me want to drive nails, but hammers can just as easily hammer heads or be used as a doorstop. The object itself, the hammer as a material thing, has its potential uses built into it as a set of material relations that it can attain. These relationships are implied by the form itself. This is why design works. Design creates a slipstream, allowing for the tool to become invisible in its extension of thinking. The possible uses of objects surrounds them, an aura of potentiality, and like Plinko from The Price is Right, they find their destiny in time. I can use microbeads in my facial cleanser, and a fish can use them to create abscesses in their intestines because he thought they were food. Stupid fish. Possibility plays out in relationship. Possibility is both inductive and deductive. From Debord's Society of the Spectacle, the society which, by fixing itself in place locally, gives space a content by arranging individualized places, thus finds itself enclosed inside this localization, this invention of place. The temporal return to similar places now becomes the pure return of time in the same place, the repetition of a series of gestures. Time is a circle, but the circle is not round. Art invents its public, drawing out the repetition of bodies, the repetition of a series of gestures. We are more alike than we are different. Things that can happen, given enough time, do happen. With just one infinity, everything that can happen will happen. The meaning is both in the thing and between things. But the thing has no essence outside its relationship to other things. Or rather, its essence dissolves at the boundaries of its world. The tool becomes symbol, or rather a tool of a different order, as it finds its destiny in the set of all possible uses, like the desire of a Tetris block to fit into the place that it can fit. This desire is magnetic, pulling us toward the obvious conclusions. Maybe this is why breakthroughs in science and art sometimes happen nearly simultaneously, because worlds overlap, and what is visible and obvious in one may be invisible in another. You can feel this in the jargon that we adopt, or you may hold a tool and have no notion of its purpose. You can feel this when you hold a gun. The work of art works on you. Terence McKenna, cultural critic and psychonaut, often talked about the machine at the end of time, calling it the eschaton. The basic idea is that with continual progress plus time, technology will eventually reach its endpoint. It will find what can be found, beyond Kurzweil's singularity, past Vonnegut's Ice 9. It is the idea of convergent evolution, that practical solutions like mobility or sight will emerge again and again because they are effective. This desire is outside humanness. Its anthropomorphic moorings loosen agency's ideological grip, letting us back into the realm of possibility, the realm where we recognize ourselves as the universe awakened to itself, where our looking out is revealed as a reflection of our inner states. Possibilities call out to us. The ideas are already out there looking for us, and we are just the kind of thing that can be found by them and manifest and embody them. We are a thing that is transformed by ideas. We are self-selecting environments in the interplay of thing against thing, paradoxical metonymic images. It is not just we who look through lenses, dialing depth of field, but also the world, feedback loops of complexity, pattern seeking and pattern generating. Part 2. Things get weird. The cathedral and the internet. Technology and the abject. From Prometheus to Eve, knowledge has always been dangerous. Knowledge is what separates the humans from the gods, and for some reason the gods are always pissed. Technology is knowledge's output. The power of the atom bomb is like the wrath of God, ending the game completely. Or the promise of atomic energy to create a nearly free power source. If you ignore that everlasting pile of hot shit, maybe atomic energy never was what it was cracked up to be, and so too with the cathedrals and the internet. Technology is abject. Julia Kristeva in The Powers of Horror describes the abject as the jettison object that is radically excluded and draws me toward the place where meaning collapses. In the McLuhan sense, technology is overriding our narratives, drawing us toward the place where meaning collapses. The search for knowledge leads us to look into the hidden places. It leads into the body with its juices and excreta. It leads into the earth to extract the secret power of accumulated eons. To power our fossil fuel-based culture, we dig up dead dinosaurs, the sensate world of giant bodies, squished into a magical paste to fuel our seemingly unquenchable human hunger for toys. The material that was once the muscle power of the Brontosaurus, the muscle power of every organic thing caught up in the crush of time, stored, compressed, transformed, and returned. Its energetic potential made accessible through human cooperation and human imagination. The point here is the folding over of time, the churn that squeezes mammoths into mattresses, like so many tadpoles in the back of a frog, wriggling in their frog pockets. We are the niche-made world come awake, but awake only to our self-made world. To that stupid fish, microbeads look like lunch. And to us, dinosaur shit looks like a hot rod. In a conversation called The Summer Way between Norman Mailer and Marshall McLuhan from 1968, both men touch on the role of the artist in society. McLuhan sees the role of the artist as the lone individual able to confront the present moment, to take the information overload, and discern the patterns that reveal what our world is made of. Whenever a new environment goes around an old one, there is always new terra. We live in a time when we have put a man-made satellite environment around the planet. The planet is no longer nature. It's no longer the external world. It is now the content of an artwork, said Marshall McLuhan. This new terra is the way that one sphere of being eats another, and, in his use of world, an echo of Heidegger. The realization that sense of self is locked into a network of individual and historical accidents, that the words we use invent not just who we think we are, but where we think we are. I think it is easy to see McLuhan's man-made satellite environment in the internet. And it is not just Langer's sense of virtual space or McLuhan's new terra, but the disturbingly literal VR that is indeed new ground. VR opens up a literal new dimension. Technology is inviting us in as it moves persistently closer to us, we into it into us. Technology makes an anachronism of the human being, a point made time and again by the post-human philosophers, cyborgs that we are. We've left the semblance of a human world behind, or rather, constant becoming is really annoying because the imaginary past never existed, and I keep getting sucked into the attraction and repulsion of thing against thing, internet meme. The internet is a self-selecting system allowing the viewer to experience the illusion that they are in control, missing the fact that the internet is a curated space. Internets have an architecture that constrains possibilities, creates semblance. At one level, the internet is a self-curated space. Everywhere I look, I see myself reflected back. So while the promise of the internet seemed to be that of a window onto the world as a repository of all human knowledge, it ends up being a mirror. Big data makes this a one-way mirror. The internet becomes the confessional booth. So, who are the priests? And can we trust them? Those attention-grabbing wizards drawing us in with clickbait and casino-like pauses. The mistake is to think that the computer is a window rather than a mirror, that it says more about the world than it does about you. We are a confused Narcissus. Part 3. things become problematic. The cathedral, the internet, and the Anthropocene. We are in what Paul Crutzen calls the Anthropocene, a term demarcating this moment in geological time as distinct because of the impact that human activity is having on the biosphere itself. What is at issue is the scale and dramatic character of those changes. If climate change plays out as predicted, we will be facing massive population shifts because of rising open oceans, disrupted growing cycles, more powerful and more frequent storms, and subsequent deprivations and conflicts arising out of such dramatic shifts. The science is nothing short of apocalyptic. We should probably add pandemics to that list. The forces that we confront are hyperobjects that at least have metaphorical lives of their own. These hyperobjects, these higher dimensional machines of accumulating collective action, have a powerful momentum that exceeds our ability to grasp them. Does the hyperobject called climate change begin with James Watt's 1784 steam engine, or did it begin with Prometheus? The mythological beginnings of human technological advancement, fire in particular. The causes and effects are stretched out in time and space such that they don't rely on any particular individual within the system, but are an emergent property of the collective. The big difference is not that we find ourselves in the next major Earth extinction event, which we do, but that we have the self-awareness to see what is occurring, and that we have the potential to take action. It is this potential to act that raises the stakes. If you take this account seriously, then what is needed is a massive act of collective will. Similar to the threats found in religious texts, repent or burn, and similarly politicized, it is this comparison that interests me here. Tangential perhaps, but it is the parallel worlds of the cathedral and the internet. The cathedral is the promise of the universal answers. The internets are, or at least purport to be, the repository of all human knowledge, all possible answers. Everything that I can think to look for, I find. And usually there's a YouTuber with hundreds of hours of videos to tell me all about it. Look up how to sharpen your chainsaw. It's way better than Game of Thrones. Look up organic gardening. Things that cannot be digitized will be left behind in a way similar to the Council of Nicaea deciding on what is canon. Only in this case, we vote with our attention. Wikipedia over encyclopedia, and iTunes over record store. YouTube over broadcast TV, and Periscope wants to be better than hanging out with your friends. Facebook wants to be better than family. From porn to pancakes, access to quantity, barriers to entry have all but dropped away, leaving me staring blankly at my own reflection. The internet's a maze, capture our gaze, and I just can't look away. And why would I want to? Because the internet is an extension of me, a portal that gives me access to the sublime. With this technological sublime, I want to draw a straight line to the metaphysical sublime found in cathedrals. The way they make me feel my smallness in their vaulted heights. But here are some other uncanny parallels. Both promise universal knowledge. Both use windows. The stained glass and paintings type in the cathedrals, and the apples variety. Both rely heavily on virtual space. The Susan Langer type in the cathedrals, and the Newtera type in the computer. This is why it feels so familiar. Because we have heard this tale before. We have occupied this space before, and both tell us a tale of our impending and seeming inevitable doom. This apocalypse brought to you by Alphabet. I'm not saying that technology and science are the new religion, just that most of us, most of the time, prostrate ourselves before it, worship it, fondle it, golems that we are. Climate change has its so-called controversy concerning the science and what actions need to be taken, but that is not what interests me here. What does it mean to be an individual amidst a collective? Is it proper here to define the individual at the scale of one human body, or is it more appropriate to define it at the larger scale of the community, or at the smaller scale? Could we address climate change by changing our collective microbiome? Maybe fecal transplants can save us. Google the rise of the do-it-yourself fecal transplant. It could improve more than just your weekend. Can I make paintings that reimagine the human species as superorganism and change the world? Can I act ethically in this historical moment? Or what role do ethics and empathy play in a non-human centered world? The superorganism has its own effects. Emergent properties or epiphenomenon resulting from cumulative action. But can the superorganism take direction? If the whole is emergent, can the parts steer this ship? Could the bacteria growing under my big toe Skype me advice about running shoes? Embedded in this question is the assumption that individual action is itself self-directed. Or are we, as individuals, likewise locked into intractable behavior patterns like E.O. Wilson's ant colony? Do we also simply wait for a chance mutation of DNA or environmental pressure to shape new outcomes? Hive mind seemingly has goals of its own, with the individual ant having no notion of them, and as a result, no ability to act freely in relationship to them. Yet collective action coheres for the colony's survival. How strong is this analogy to human societies? How strong for the individual self? In nature, things happen because they can happen. We are in nature. We are nature. For ants, no free will, but the survival of the colony. What about Homo sapiens? Where is the Henry David Thoreau of the ant world? In the woods, keeping tiny track of personal expenditures? The ants demonstrate that free will is not a requirement for collective action and collective impact. But what of reactivity? What of self-reflection? The individual capacity to take action based on rational decision-making is implicit to our politicized discourse. But if I watch myself closely, I'm not so sure. The conundrum of collective action is personal choice. Technology is a mistake that we are all making. Technology has built this brighter future we all inhabit, and also our dreams of still brighter futures to come. Technology is also the cause of our collective catastrophe. Technology is the extended phenotype of the human. We are awestruck, immobilized in wonder by our shiny sublime, by these images of ourselves oscillating in the terrible beauty of failed videos, and both faked and real outrage, faked and real death. In the terrible beauty of the world digesting itself, it becomes the choice that we cannot make, Eve's choice, Prometheus's gift. But Prometheus forgot to request a gift receipt, and we just keep repurposing and regifting to our grandchildren. It is a choice that is difficult or maybe impossible to see, because this world is a virtual one. It's Baudrillard's simulacrum, it's Langer's semblance, it's Heidegger's world. And we face the same question of complicity that haunts Heidegger. Complicity is both his shadow and ours. What can help us to unstuck ourselves from the narrative and imagine otherwise? Art? But if art is everywhere, if, as McLuhan says, the planet is no longer nature, it's no longer the external world, it is now the content of an artwork, then who is to say what potential could accrue given more time, or if potential was to flow through a time dominated by very different minds, artificial intelligences, or maybe we wait for cockroaches to wake up to themselves and to the world. They would certainly have something to say about survival, indeed question and reshape our basic understanding of space and selfhood. Insect logic. Part 4. Inner and outer. A less weird, more optimistic, and more practical application. I'm putting forward a view that's trying to be informed by object-oriented ontology, by my struggle to understand the philosophers mentioned and to come to grips with the various constraints of living in this body, in this place, in this time? Can the recognition that my sense of the real as a series of overlaps, postmodern bubbles, create more maneuverability, more freedom? If we are always already dealing with illusion, if we inhabit that illusion at the level of the body and at the level of culture, and if these illusions are nested, then who says I have to believe in any singular reality just because it is coherent? We don't have to identify with the illusions that position us just because that is who and what we are. Why continue to reify memories I have overwritten thousands of times, even though it looks real? I do not believe in the magic. I don't trust my own mind because I'm an artist. I am not to be trusted. I have learned time and again that I get things wrong. I willfully create illusions. So I ask you to come and dance with me in this hall of mirrors. The names are not the things, but the things are not the things either. Maneuverability comes from cultivating awareness of how our conclusions are connected to larger bodies, to hyperobjects, helping us to collaborate appropriate responses. What does it mean to act ethically now? It is this cultivation of awareness of ethical action that I use to structure foundation-level drawing. The question for beginning drawing becomes, what information set is being used to motivate action? If you want to change the work, you need to either change how you are thinking, or you need to change how you are acting in response to that thinking. Ultimately, the goal is to set young artists up to be able to see and then feel the pull of the work itself, to be responsive to the opportunities that arise, to see the potential that can't have been seen from the outset, to learn to embrace and extend those possible worlds, to create the space and then inhabit it. The space of the work, but also the space of who they will become and what kind of community we can have, both in and outside the classroom. The individual is like a membrane stretched between and put in tension by inner and outer forces. We are flow systems from outer to inner and back again. For foundations level drawing, the inner is drawing from imagination and the outer is drawing from the visual field. Because of drawing's directness, the call and response of art making is close to immediate. This directness brings the maker back to the body. You have to move the body to make the mark. While still mediated, the primary technology of drawing is the body and mind of the artist. It collapses the distance between thinking and thing. It allows for more decisions to happen in real time. You can't hide from your own thinking in drawing the way you can when using more mediated approaches. When using more technology, you are collaborating directly with the minds that structured those technologies. The artist in the digital space is the coder. I think this footnote from Ian de Thompson's book, Heidegger, Art and Postmodernity, brings it into focus. Think of the difference between web page design just a few years ago and the standardized web palette instantly available to users of Facebook and Squarespace, which encourage these users to imagine they can best express themselves by selecting from an array of predefined options. Rather than by struggling to understand what they really want to say, the goal is to build into the drawing itself a way to check your work, to allow the maker to move through the labyrinth using a completely different map, to become polysemic. This is separate from the reading of the work, and becoming versatile and resilient in the making is a step to becoming resilient in unpacking and understanding. This approach seeks to create a division in the tried and true approaches to teaching drawing as a way of separating the maker from themselves, placing emphasis on the parameters that shape our decision making, with the assumption that if I can see the parameters, then I can make a strategic response to those parameters. The things that are invisible to us have an outsized power over us. I think that this is true in life as in art. The things that are invisible to us have an outsized power over us. I think this is true in art as in life. It is my goal as an art educator to become a catalyst and motivator, to provide conditions for growth, a hothouse of art energy. I see it as my role as teacher, mentor, to introduce students to the vast dialogue of art, to help them understand the language of art as they are finding and tempering their own voice. It is my goal to support maximum maneuverability for students, creative freedom. My assumption is that awareness is the path. To be a maker is to see through the illusion to the practical questions of material, to see how something is put together, and to put together a new something. I am not interested in who my students are. I'm interested in who they will become. That's it. Let's drink more tea. All right. That's the first episode of Throwing Your Toys Away with Benjamin Duke. And I look forward to when I'm speaking with you again. Hopefully the next few episodes at least are going to be less just me reading and making this into a book on tape, and more just like going, I think I'd like to go point by point through a couple of articles, start to dig into how I think about art teaching, how I think about art making, share that with you. And really, I'd like to respond to questions people have, comments that people have. So of course, you'll need to put those comments in the comments section below. And, if we could have a back and forth, that's really what I'm looking for. And it's really what has motivated me in the past to create Fourth Culture Studios, where I like to say there's culture, there's counterculture, there's the reactionaries, and then there's us. And, maybe culture's experiencing such a dramatic shift in this moment that, maybe there could be a fourth way. So I don't know. But that's it. Oh, let me say this, because I know I only have 9 subscribers. If you'd like to try the pour tea, then email me outside of, don't list your, email me and I'll send you some. And then we can drink pour tea together, talk about art together, and figure this space out. All right, space out. I'll see you next time.